The wind off the Atlantic did not just blow through the city, it bit. At 79, she knew the precise geometry of survival on a December night. She sat on a frozen concrete ledge just 3 blocks from the harbor, her back pressed against the exhaust vent of a luxury condominium complex. The air rushing out tasted of stale filters and expensive heating, but it was warm. In her weathered, trembling hands, she clutched 2 heavy-duty blue plastic bags. They contained everything she owned: 3 pairs of mismatched socks, a threadbare woolen blanket, a dented tin cup, and a faded photograph of a life she could no longer fully remember. Every winter in this city was a battle of attrition, and lately, her bones whispered that she was losing. Her feet, swollen and wrapped in layers of damp newspaper inside oversized boots, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. She watched the wealthy residents step out of yellow cabs, wrapped in cashmere, their laughter cutting through the frozen air like breaking glass. They did not see her. To them, she was just another shadow merged with the urban landscape, a fixture of the pavement. When the security guard finally came out with a broom and a pointed stare, she did not argue. She gathered her plastic bags, her knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white against the handles, and pushed herself up. She walked toward the public shelter on 4th Street, a bleak brick sanctuary where the desperate congregated for a bowl of watery broth and a cot. The air inside the shelter was heavy with the smell of wet wool, bleach, and human misery. She found a corner near the back wall, away from the intake desk, and carefully tucked her bags beneath her legs. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to shield herself from the fluorescent glare that hummed like a swarm of angry hornets. She was so tired, a deep, cellular exhaustion that food could not cure. The heavy metal double doors of the shelter swung open, letting in a blast of Arctic air and a man who clearly did not belong there. He wore a crisp, tailored winter coat and carried a sleek leather portfolio. His eyes scanned the crowded, noisy room with a mixture of professional detachment and intense discomfort. He approached the intake desk, spoke briefly to the shelter manager, and pointed toward her corner. The manager nodded, looking surprised. She opened her eyes as the man stopped directly in front of her. He looked down, his expression softening slightly but remaining strictly professional. He asked if she was who she was, using a name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in over 40 years. Hearing it felt like a ghost touching her shoulder. She gave a slow, cautious nod, her grip tightening on the plastic bags beneath her chair. The man knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level, and opened his portfolio. He produced a thick, creamy envelope stamped with a bright red wax seal and a label that read, "Certified Legal Notice." He explained that he was a courier representing a probate law firm downtown. For 3 weeks, they had been searching the city's shelters, soup kitchens, and free clinics to find her. He placed a heavy metal pen in her hand and pointed to a signature line on a clipboard. Her fingers were stiff, but she managed to scratch her initials into the paper. He handed her the envelope, stood up, and wished her luck before disappearing back out into the freezing night as quickly as he had arrived. She stared at the envelope in her lap. The weight of the paper felt foreign against her calloused skin. With trembling fingers, she tore open the top edge. Inside was a single page of heavy parchment and a rusted, intricately carved iron key. The letter was written in the dry, unfeeling jargon of an estate attorney, but the reality of the words pierced through the legalese. Her father was dead. He had passed away alone at the age of 98 in a small room above his business. She hadn't seen or spoken to him since she was a teenager. He had been an eccentric, obsessive man, a reclusive horologist who cared infinitely more for the ticking of brass gears than the emotional needs of his only child. He had driven her away with his madness, burying himself in his workshop while the world passed him by. Now, he was gone, and she was his sole living heir. But there was no grand fortune awaiting her. The letter explicitly stated that his estate was entirely bankrupt. The only asset remaining was the property itself, a tiny, dilapidated clock shop nestled in the old industrial district of the city. The structure had been officially condemned by the city council 3 months prior due to structural neglect and severe safety violations. Furthermore, the property was burdened with decades of unpaid back taxes, interest, and municipal fines. According to the official probate assessment attached to the document, the market value of the entire property, after subtracting the massive liens against it, was exactly $10, a $10 clock shop. It was a final, parting joke from a man who had given her nothing in life and now left her a liability in death. The letter informed her that she had 30 days to claim the property or sign it over to the state for demolition. She looked at the rusted iron key resting against her palm. It felt cold, but it didn't bite like the winter wind. She looked around the shelter, at the fighting, the weeping, and the absolute lack of dignity that defined her daily existence. $10 or not, condemned or not, the shop had 4 walls and a roof. For the first time in a decade, she had a key to a door that she had the legal right to lock from the inside. She gathered her 2 plastic bags, stood up from the cot, and walked out into the dark, ready to claim her $10 empire. The journey across town took her nearly 2 hours on foot. Her breath bloomed in white plumes before her, and the handles of the 2 plastic bags sawed into her frozen palms, but she did not stop. She walked away from the neon glare of the commercial district, watching the city mutate. The glittering glass towers gradually gave way to the brutalist concrete of the old industrial sector, a place where progress had stalled decades ago. Finally, tucked away on a narrow, forgotten alleyway between 2 towering monolithic skyscrapers, she found it. The shop looked less like a building and more like a geographic anomaly, a stubborn tooth of the past refusing to be pulled by the modern world. It was a narrow, 3-story structure, built of soot-stained red brick, its facade warped by time. The windows were opaque with years of grime, crisscrossed with jagged cracks and reinforced with rusted iron bars. A faded wooden sign hung precariously from a single rusted chain above the entrance, the gold leaf lettering long peeled away to reveal a faint, ghostly outline of the word horology. The towering modern buildings on either side cast the structure into a permanent, suffocating shadow, effectively erasing it from the city's memory. It looked dead, abandoned, and utterly worthless. She stood before the heavy oak door, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her frail ribs. Her hand shook violently as she pulled the rusted iron key from her pocket. She guided it into the ancient, oversized keyhole. For a terrifying second, the mechanism resisted, frozen by decades of neglect and cold. She leaned her shoulder against the wood, channeling every ounce of her remaining strength, and twisted. With a loud, metallic crack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet alley, the deadbolt finally yielded. She pushed the door open. A heavy, stagnant wave of air rushed out to meet her, so dense it made her cough. It was an intoxicating, suffocating mixture of pulverized dust, decaying wood, and the pungent, chemical tang of whale oil and graphite grease. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her to shut out the howling wind, and the silence of the room swallowed her whole. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she realized she was standing in a tomb of time. Every square inch of the walls was covered in clocks. There were massive dark-wood cuckoos from the Black Forest, delicate porcelain mantel clocks, severe brass maritime chronometers, and long-faced regulators, hundreds of them, but none of them were ticking. The silence was absolute, unnatural, and heavy. The pendulums hung perfectly still, like miniature guillotines frozen mid-drop. The brass hands pointed in every conceivable direction, a chaotic mosaic of fractured moments. One clock insisted it was 3 o'clock, another claimed it was midnight. It was a visual manifestation of her father's mind, completely detached from the reality of the world outside, trapped in a reality where time had simply quit. A thick layer of gray dust coated every surface, transforming the entire showroom into a monochromatic museum. Cobwebs hung like tattered lace from the ceilings, draping over the ornate carvings of the wooden casings. She walked forward slowly, her boots leaving deep, stark footprints in the velvet dust on the floorboards. She reached out a trembling finger and touched the glass face of a small brass carriage clock on the counter. The glass was ice cold, but beneath the grime, the brass still held a faint, defiant glint. Behind the counter lay a narrow workspace, a sanctuary of obsolescence. A heavy workbench was cluttered with the skeletal remains of disassembled timepieces, tiny gears, delicate mainsprings coiled like miniature serpents, magnifying loops, and specialized screwdrivers so small they looked like needles. A leather-bound ledger sat open on the desk, its pages yellowed and curled, covered in her father's tight, manic handwriting. The air inside was freezing, but it lacked the moving, predatory bite of the winter wind outside. The thick brick walls insulated the space from the Arctic drafts. She looked down at the floor behind the counter. The space was tight, but it was shielded from the front windows. For the first time in more years than she could count, she was not looking for a piece of cardboard or a steam vent. She was not watching her back for predators or listening for the harsh voice of a security guard telling her to move along. She carefully set her 2 blue plastic bags down against the base of the workbench. She pulled out her threadbare woolen blanket and shook it, releasing a small cloud of lint into the stagnant air. She laid it out over the dusty floorboards, using one of her bags filled with spare clothing as a makeshift pillow. She lay down, curling her frail body into a tight ball, pulling the edges of the blanket up to her chin. Through the dim light filtering through the grime of the front window, she could see the dark silhouettes of the silent clocks towering over her like a vanguard of ancient sentinels. The smell of old oil and iron was strange, but it felt honest. It felt like her heritage, however broken it might be. As she finally closed her eyes, letting the absolute stillness of the shop wash over her, she realized she didn't care that the property was only worth $10. For the first time in a decade, she was safe. She fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, cradled in the belly of a giant, silent machine. The sharp, rhythmic crack of leather dress shoes against the floorboards shattered her sleep. She bolted upright, her heart hammering against her ribs, the threadbare blanket slipping from her shoulders. Daylight, gray and thin, filtered through the filthy front windows, illuminating millions of dust motes dancing in the air. Standing in the center of the showroom, looking completely entirely out of place among the dead clocks, was a man. He wore an immaculate, charcoal-gray tailored overcoat with a silk scarf looped around his neck. His hair was slicked back, untouched by the winter wind, and he smelled strongly of expensive cologne and premium leather. He didn't look at the historical pieces on the walls. He looked at the ceiling cracks with a cold, calculating appraisal. When his eyes finally landed on her rising from behind the counter, a flash of disgust crossed his face before being instantly replaced by a polished, predatory smile. He took a step forward, his shoes crunching against the grit on the floor. He didn't introduce himself. Instead, he pulled a thick, gold-embossed fountain pen from his breast pocket and tapped it rhythmically against his palm. He told her she was a difficult woman to track down, adding that he had expected the city to clear this eyesore out weeks ago. She stood straight, leaning her weight against the sturdy oak workbench to hide the trembling in her legs. She clutched the edge of the wood, her knuckles turning white. She asked him who he was and what he wanted in her shop. His smile widened, devoid of any warmth. He gestured vaguely toward the towering skyscrapers visible through the grimy window. He explained that he was the principal developer for the glass monoliths flanking her current dwelling. His company owned the entire block, every square inch of concrete from the corner avenue to the harbor line, except for this single, decaying footprint. He called the shop an island of garbage in a sea of progress. He reached into his overcoat and pulled out a sleek, black leather folder, tossing it onto the counter between them. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud, sending up a small cloud of gray dust. He told her he was a generous man who liked to solve problems quickly. Inside the folder was a standard quitclaim deed and a stack of crisp $100 bills, $500 to be exact. He told her it was more money than she had likely seen in a decade. He instructed her to sign the document, take the cash, and vacate the premises immediately. He claimed his demolition crews were scheduled to tear down the walls by the end of the week anyway, and he was simply offering her a charitable way out before the city seized it for back taxes. She looked down at the money. To a woman who had spent the last 10 years counting pennies for a hot cup of broth, $500 felt like a small fortune. It could buy her a room in a boarding house for 2 months. It could buy her real food and warm boots. Her fingers twitched toward the folder. The temptation was in physical weight, pulling at her exhausted muscles. But then she looked up at him. She noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he held out the pen. She saw the way his eyes darted toward his luxury sedan, idling in the alleyway outside, its exhaust pluming in the cold air. Most of all, she caught the aggressive, suffocating urgency in his voice. If the city was truly going to seize the building, and if his crews were already legally cleared to demolish it, He wouldn't be standing here in a dusty tomb, offering cash to a homeless woman. He would have just waited for the bulldozers. He was desperate. He needed her signature, and he needed it before anyone else realized she was here. She drew her hand back from the desk, crossing her arms over her chest. She told him no. She said she had just inherited the property, and she wasn't in a hurry to sell it. The polished facade dropped instantly. His eyes narrowed into slits, and his jaw tightened so hard a muscle twitched beneath his manicured skin. He leaned over the counter, invading her space, bringing the suffocating scent of his cologne with him. He told her not to be a fool. He reminded her that she was 79, living in filth, and that the city had already condemned the structure. He said the building was a hazard, the taxes owed were 10 times what the land was worth, and if she didn't take the $500, she would end up right back on the concrete freezing to death with nothing. The venom in his voice sent a chill down her spine, but it also solidified her resolve. The survival instinct that had kept her alive on the brutal winter streets for 10 years flared to life. She didn't know what he was hiding, but she knew that whatever was inside these walls was worth infinitely more to him than $500. She looked him dead in the eye, keeping her voice level, flat, and unyielding. She told him she needed 24 hours to review the legal documents. She told him to leave his paperwork, and if everything was as he said it was, she would sign it the following morning. He stared at her for a long, silent moment, evaluating her like an obstacle to be cleared. For a second, she feared he might physically reach across the counter and force her. Instead, he snatched the stack of $100 bills back from the counter, stuffing them into his pocket, though he left the black leather folder sitting in the dust. He checked his gold wristwatch, the metal gleaming in the dim light of the shop. He gave her until exactly 8 o'clock the next morning. He warned her that if she hadn't signed the deed by the time he returned, he would bring the city building inspectors, the police, and an immediate eviction order. He told her she would be removed from the property in handcuffs, and her 2 plastic bags of belongings would be thrown into a dumpster. He turned on his heel, his heavy coat swirling around him, and stormed out of the shop. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind him, sending a violent vibration through the floorboards. Around her, the hundreds of dead clocks rattled on the walls, their silent pendulums swaying a fraction of an inch from the impact before settling back into stillness. She was alone again, the silence returning like a heavy blanket, but the room felt different now. The clock was ticking, not literally, but the metaphoric countdown had begun. She had less than 24 hours to figure out what a ruthless billionaire wanted with a $10 piece of junk. The echo of the slammed door finally died, leaving behind a silence so profound it made her ears ring. She stood paralyzed behind the counter for several long minutes, waiting for her racing pulse to slow. The developer's threat hung in the damp air like smoke. 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. The deadline was a physical countdown, an invisible blade suspended above her head. She looked at her trembling hands, then down at the empty black leather folder on the counter. She had no money, no lawyer, and no power against a man who owned the surrounding skyline. All she had was this crumbling building, and whatever secret was buried within its bones. She grabbed a rusted, battery-powered flashlight from a shelf behind the counter. The beam was weak and yellow, cutting through the gloom as she moved toward the back of the shop. The front showroom held standard timepieces, but the deeper she walked into the narrow structure, the older and more complex the machinery became. She passed rows of skeleton clocks, their brass innards exposed like ribs, and pocket watches hanging from velvet boards like dead moths. The air grew progressively colder, smelling heavier of decay and ancient iron. At the absolute rear of the shop, hidden behind a rotting velvet curtain that had once been deep crimson, she found the centerpiece. The flashlight beam trembled over its face. It was a grandfather clock, but its scale was monumental. Standing nearly 9 feet tall, it was constructed from dark, almost black walnut wood, completely encased in ornate, hand-carved brass filigree. The carvings depicted celestial maps, constellations, and mythical figures pulling the sun across the sky. The clock face itself was a massive disc of solid silver, tarnished to a deep charcoal gray, with heavy gold Roman numerals. It didn't just tell hours and minutes. It had subdials for the phases of the moon, the tides, and the zodiac calendar. At the base of the dial, a small, elegant engraving read, London, 1888. It was a masterpiece, a relic from the height of the industrial age, completely frozen. Unlike the other clocks in the shop, which looked merely neglected, this one felt imposing, almost deliberate in its stillness. The massive brass pendulum, thick as a human arm, hung dead center through the glass casing. She walked back to her father's workbench, her boots scraping against the grit. She picked up the heavy, leather-bound ledger she had seen earlier. It wasn't a ledger at all. It was a handwritten mechanic's manual, its pages brittle and stained with decades of oil fingerprints. She carried it back to the giant clock, setting it open on a dusty stool nearby. The pages were filled with meticulous, hyper-detailed technical drawings of complex escapements, gear trains, and weight systems. In the margins, her father's tight script repeated a single phrase over and over. "The core holds the truth. Look past the movement." Determined, she pulled up the stool and set to work. She selected a fine, long-handled camel hair brush and a small bottle of specialized solvent from the workbench. Her father had trained her hands when she was a little girl, before his obsession had eaten his mind, and the muscle memory returned to her stiff fingers like an old friend. She carefully opened the side access panels of the grandfather clock's wooden hood. She began to clean. With slow, rhythmic strokes, she cleared decades of hardened grease, dust, and spiderwebs from the intricate gear train. She worked under the weak yellow light, oblivious to the passage of real time, focused entirely on the brass teeth before her. She cleaned the escape wheel, the pallets, and the winding barrels. The mechanical complexity was staggering, a labyrinth of miniature wheels overlapping in perfect symmetry. Yet, as she cleaned deeper into the mechanism, she noticed something highly irregular. The gears were immaculate beneath the dust. There was no rust, no broken teeth, and no warped axles. By all laws of mechanics, a clock in this pristine structural condition should have moved, even if only for a few seconds, when she gently touched the pendulum. But when she put her finger against the heavy brass disc and gave it a soft push, it didn't budge. It felt as if it were welded to the frame. She leaned closer, pressing her cheek against the cold wood of the casing, shining the flashlight deep into the throat of the machine where the heavy driving weights hung. The weights were supposed to pull down on steel cables, wound around the main barrels, providing the gravitational force that kept the clock alive. That was when she saw it. Deep inside the dark recess of the primary spring case, the central housing cylinder meant to control the tension of the mechanism, something was wrong. It wasn't a mechanical failure. A heavy, hand-forged steel wedge had been driven violently between the teeth of the main center wheel and the arbor. It was an intentional act of sabotage, executed with surgical precision. The wedge had been pounded into place from the inside, deliberately locking the entire 9-foot apparatus into a permanent, unbreakable stasis. Her father hadn't failed to fix this clock. He had murdered its movement on purpose. She sat back on the stool, her breath catching in her throat as the realization washed over her. The developer wasn't trying to buy a plot of land, he was trying to buy this specific room. And her father hadn't spent 40 years hiding from the world out of mere insanity. He was guarding a vault. She stared at the steel wedge deep within the brass gears. The answer to her survival, the secret that made this $10 shop worth a fortune, was trapped inside that locked spring case, and she had exactly 14 hours left to get it out. The midnight air inside the shop grew so cold her breath materialized in thick, ghost-like clouds. The yellow beam of the flashlight began to flicker, its battery dying, casting long, erratic shadows across the faces of the silent clocks on the walls. She ignored the chill. Her focus was locked entirely on the steel wedge paralyzing the giant machine. She tried to pry it loose using a flathead screwdriver from the workbench, but the metal did not budge. The pressure holding it in place was immense, a physical tension built up over decades of forced stasis. She turned back to her father's handwritten manual, flipping through the brittle pages until she found a sketch of the pendulum assembly. The drawing was unconventional. The heavy brass shaft of the pendulum was depicted not as a solid rod, but as a hollow tube, and the massive circular bob at the bottom showed a hidden seam. She knelt at the base of the 9-foot clock, her knees popping in the silence. She reached into the dark casing and grasped the heavy brass disc at the bottom of the pendulum. It was cold enough to stick to her skin. She twisted the ornate finial at the very tip of the disc. It resisted at first, but with a hard, desperate wrench, the metal groaned and turned. The front plate of the brass bob slid open like a secret drawer. Inside the hollowed-out pendulum sat a small, rusted iron key, wrapped in a scrap of oily rag to keep it from rattling. She pulled the key out, her fingers trembling so violently she nearly dropped it into the dark depths of the clock base. It was a strange key, short and stout, with a complex pattern of teeth that matched nothing on the outside of the casing. She climbed back onto the wooden stool, lifting her flashlight to illuminate the primary mainspring barrel, the heavy cylinder at the absolute core of the movement that housed the clock's power source. On the back plate of the cylinder, completely obscured by the surrounding framework and decades of dust she had just cleared, was a tiny, circular keyhole. She inserted the key. It slid into the keyhole with a perfect, hydraulic smoothness that sent a shiver down her spine. She took a deep breath, braced her feet against the rungs of the stool, and turned the key clockwise. A series of deep, metallic clicks echoed through the hollow wooden case as the internal locking pins disengaged. With a heavy, satisfying thud, the front face of the mainspring barrel popped open, pivoting on a hidden hinge. She braced herself, expecting the violent, lethal snap of a tightly wound steel spring uncoiling toward her face. She flinched, covering her eyes. But there was no explosion of metal. The massive steel mainspring was there, but it had been meticulously bypassed, its lethal tension safely locked away by secondary pins. Instead of the tight, dangerous coils of a functional clock mechanism, the center of the cylinder had been completely hollowed out to create a weatherproof vault. Resting snugly within the circular chamber was a thick, rectangular parcel, tightly wrapped in heavy, oil-skinned canvas and bound with wax twine. The smell of old wax and waterproof sealant filled her nose, fresh and sharp, preserved perfectly for 40 years. She reached her thin, calloused hand into the gears and pulled the parcel out. It was surprisingly heavy, its contents stiff and unyielding. She climbed down from the stool, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, and carried the bundle to her father's workbench. She used a small pocket knife to slice through the brittle wax twine, peeling back the layers of stiff, oil-skinned cloth. The first thing she uncovered was a stack of large, ornate documents printed on heavy, woven paper that had not yellowed with age. They bore intricate, hand-engraved borders and official gold seals that caught the dim light of her flashlight. She rubbed her thumb over the raised ink. They were historical gold bonds, issued by the city's municipal treasury in the late 19th century, backed by the federal government. She blinked, staring at the face value printed on the top note, followed by a string of zeros that made her dizzy. They were bearer bonds, completely legal, untraceable, and accumulated decades of compounded interest. Beneath the bonds lay a series of original, handwritten land deeds. The parchment was crisp, bearing the elegant cursive signatures of the city's founding families from over a century ago. She scanned the legal descriptions, her eyes widening as she recognized the boundary lines. These weren't just any plots of land. These deeds established ownership of the exact 4-block radius surrounding her shop, the very land currently occupied by the luxury skyscrapers and the commercial empire of the developer who had threatened her just hours ago. According to these documents, the land had never been legally sold to the city or to private corporations. It had been placed into a permanent, irrevocable public trust, designated solely to fund housing, health care, and sanctuary for the city's impoverished and homeless citizens. The corporate skyscrapers flanking her shop were built on stolen ground, their foundations resting on a massive, historic fraud. At the very bottom of the parcel lay a small, leather-bound notebook. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably her father's, but it lacked the manic, chaotic energy of the mechanic's manual. It was clear, precise, and heavy with regret. "To my daughter," the entry began, dated the year she had run away from home. "If you are reading this, the gears have finally stopped, and the world has caught up to my silence. I know you think I lost my mind to these machines. I let you believe it to keep you safe. Decades ago, the city's powerful elite sought to destroy these deeds to build their empires of glass and greed. They murdered the men who held them. I took the documents and hid them in the one place they would never look. A bankrupt shop, inside a clock valued at nothing. I jammed the mechanism because time cannot move forward until the truth is told. The shop is worth $10 to the tax assessor, but it holds the soul of this city. Do not let them take it. Turn the gears. She closed the journal, her eyes burning with tears that she hadn't shed in decades. She looked at the rusted key, the historical bonds, and the original deeds lying on the dusty workbench. Her father hadn't abandoned her out of madness. He had lived a life of isolated terror, to protect a legacy that belonged to her, and to every forgotten soul sleeping on the freezing concrete outside. She looked at the clock on the wall. It was 4 in the morning. The developer would be back in exactly 4 hours, expecting to crush a defenseless old woman. She wiped her face, a cold, hard certainty settling into her bones. The game had changed. She wasn't running anymore. She sat on the wooden stool, the dying flashlight propped against a stack of gears to illuminate the leather-bound notebook. The cold of the room no longer felt hostile. It felt like a protective shield, keeping the outside world at bay while she reassembled the shattered pieces of her past. She turned the yellowed pages of her father's journal with reverence, her eyes scanning the ink that connected his isolation to her survival. Every sentence she read dismantled a decades-old lie she had carried in her heart. He had not been a madman who loved brass and springs more than his own daughter. He had been a sentinel trapped in a prison of his own making, guarding a secret that could topple the city's skyline. The entries detailed the dark history of the surrounding blocks. In the mid-20th century, as the city began its aggressive push toward modernization, a cabal of wealthy families and corrupt politicians sought to erase the past. They discovered that the prime real estate near the harbor had been deeded in perpetuity to a charitable public trust, legally designated to provide housing and sanctuary for the destitute. Rather than honoring the trust, they decided to bury it. The original trustees disappeared or were paid off, and the official city registry records were mysteriously scrubbed in a convenient courthouse fire. Her father, then a young, brilliant horologist trusted by the city's elite to maintain their antique collections, had stumbled upon the truth. A dying member of one of the founding families, plagued by guilt, had delivered the original deeds and the accrued municipal gold bonds to his shop for safekeeping. From that moment, his life as a simple craftsman ended. He became a target. She felt a lump form in her throat as she read his descriptions of the paranoia that followed. He wrote about the shadowed figures watching his shop from across the street, the tapped phone lines, and the veiled threats delivered by men in expensive suits. He realized he could not run. The moment he tried to leave the city with the documents, he would be intercepted and killed, and the evidence would be incinerated. He had to hide them in plain sight. He chose the most monumental timepiece in his collection, hollowed out its core, and locked the truth inside the primary mainspring barrel. To ensure corporate predators and city inspectors never looked twice at the property, he deliberately engineered his own financial ruin. He stopped paying his municipal taxes, allowed the facade of the building to rot, and created a public reputation as a hostile, unhinged recluse. He forced the city to condemn the building, knowing that a condemned structure under a mountain of tax liens would be tied up in bureaucratic red tape for decades. The official probate valuation of exactly $10 was his masterpiece. It was a calculated ruse designed to make the property look like a worthless liability, a toxic asset that no sensible developer would investigate until they were absolutely ready to clear the entire block. He had driven her away, he confessed, because her presence made her a target. He knew that if his enemies discovered he had a vulnerability, they would use her to break him. "I watched you walk away into the rain," he wrote, the ink slightly smeared on the page. "It was the hardest tick of the clock I ever had to endure. But I knew that as long as you hated me, you were distant from me, and if you were distant, you were alive. I left you nothing but a key and a debt, because I knew the debt would keep the vultures away until you were old enough and the world was transparent enough for you to fight back." She stared at the words, a profound sense of validation washing over her. For 40 years, she had felt rejected, carrying the bitter shame of an abandoned child into the gutters and shelters of the city. Now, she realized she was the daughter of a guardian. The 2 plastic bags sitting on the floor, containing her meager earthly possessions, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the immense weight of the legacy she held in her lap. The deeds were clear, ironclad, and legally unassailable. They bore the original, registered seals of the Federal Land Patent Office. The developer who had threatened her earlier did not own the skyscrapers flanking her shop. His corporation was leasing stolen land from a non-existent corporate entity that had forged the title chain after the courthouse fire. If these documents were presented in a federal court, the entire multi-billion-dollar development project would freeze. The high-rises would be subject to immediate receivership, and the billions in revenue they generated would legally belong to the public trust, to the very people sleeping on the freezing concrete outside the shelter doors. The gold bonds were even more explosive. They were bearer instruments, payable to whoever held them physically in their hands. With nearly a century of compounded interest and municipal backing, their face value had inflated into a fortune that could fund the public trust for generations. She closed the notebook, the leather cover making a soft sighing sound in the quiet workshop. She looked toward the grimy front window. The sky was beginning to turn a pale, icy blue as the dawn broke over the Atlantic. The streetlights outside flickered off, and the first sounds of morning traffic began to echo down the narrow alleyway. It was 6 o'clock. In exactly 2 hours, the man in the charcoal coat would return with his fountain pen, his legal threats, and his $500, fully expecting to sweep a broken old woman into the garbage. She stood up, her posture straighter than it had been in a decade. The arthritis in her joints seemed to fade under the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She picked up the oil-skinned parcel, carefully wrapping the deeds, the bonds, and the journal back into their protective cloth. She didn't have a phone, and she didn't have connections, but her father's journal had listed one final name in the back directory, a legal aid society founded by an old friend's grandson, specifically tasked with fighting corporate land grabs. She walked to the front counter, placed the parcel inside one of her blue plastic bags, and pulled her threadbare blanket tight around her shoulders. She had 2 hours to make a phone call and set the gears of justice in motion. Her father had stopped time to protect the truth. Now, it was her turn to make it tick again. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy oak door flew open, letting in a blast of freezing morning air and the aggressive click of leather heels. The developer stepped into the showroom, flanked by 2 men in dark suits, carrying leather briefcases, and a city official wearing an official badge. He looked immaculate, his silk scarf perfectly aligned, his face wearing the smug confidence of a man who had never lost a negotiation to someone who slept on the street. He didn't look at her. He simply tossed a fresh set of legal documents onto the dusty counter, followed by the gold-embossed fountain pen. He told her time was up, instructing her to sign the paperwork so they could all get out of the cold. She did not move toward the pen. She stood behind the counter, her hands resting flat on the aged wood, her posture unyielding. She looked at him with a calm, penetrating stare that seemed to catch him off guard. She told him she wouldn't be signing anything today. He chuckled, a cold, mocking sound that rattled the silent air of the shop. He stepped closer, leaning over the counter, his polished smile melting into a sneer. He reminded her of his warning, stating that the city official beside him was ready to execute an immediate emergency eviction. He told her she would be removed in plastic restraints, her bags thrown into the alley dumpster, and that she would leave with absolutely nothing. He asked if she really wanted to spend the winter in a jail cell. A quiet, authoritative voice answered from the shadows near the back curtain. A young woman stepped forward, wearing a sharp woolen coat and carrying a battered leather briefcase. She introduced herself as an attorney from the Legal Aid Society, acting as sole legal counsel for the property owner. The developer's eyes narrowed, his gaze darting between the lawyer and the old woman. He demanded to know what kind of game they were playing, calling the legal aid interference a waste of time. He insisted the building was condemned and that his title to the surrounding blocks was ironclad. The lawyer did not argue. Instead, she unzipped her briefcase and pulled out high-resolution, certified copies of the documents she had spent the last 2 hours reviewing at the city archives, backed by the originals resting in the blue plastic bag behind the counter. She laid them out directly over the developer's quitclaim deed. First came the original, federal land patents from 1888, bearing the unassailable seals of the Constitutional Land Trust. The lawyer calmly explained that the 4-block radius, including the land beneath the developer's twin skyscrapers, had been deeded in perpetuity to a charitable public trust for the impoverished. She noted that the trust had never been legally dissolved, meaning his corporation had purchased a fraudulent title chain from a shell company that did not exist. The developer's face drained of color, turning a pasty, unwholesome gray. He snatched the documents, his manicured fingers trembling as his eyes raced across the historical descriptions and the registered seals. He insisted it was a forgery, a cheap trick from a dead lunatic's basement. The lawyer then placed a copy of the municipal gold-bearer bonds on top of the deeds. She stated that these bonds, held by her client, carried a century of compounded interest backed by the city treasury. She informed him that her firm had already filed an emergency injunction in federal district court an hour ago, freezing all development and corporate revenue on the block, pending a full title investigation. The silence that followed was suffocating. The two men in suits behind the developer stepped back, exchanging panicked glances, instantly recognizing the legal catastrophe unfolding before them. The city official quietly pocketed his eviction notice, gave a polite nod to the lawyer, and walked out the front door without saying a word. The developer looked up from the papers, the arrogant veneer completely shattered. The power dynamic had flipped in a matter of seconds. He wasn't looking at a helpless homeless woman anymore. He was looking at the woman who held the absolute destruction of his entire corporate empire in her wrinkled hands. If these documents went public in a full trial, his investors would pull out, his banks would foreclose, and he would face federal fraud charges. He was looking at total financial and personal ruin. He leaned against the counter, his chest heaving, his expensive cologne suddenly smelling like panic. His voice lost its predatory edge, dropping into a desperate, hurried whisper. He asked her what she wanted, offering to take care of her, to buy her a luxury condo anywhere in the world, to give her millions of dollars if she would just hand over the original parcel and sign the non-disclosure agreement. She looked at him, feeling neither anger nor triumph. She felt only the deep, righteous weight of her father's 40-year sacrifice. She told him she didn't want his condos or his dirty money. She told him he was going to leave his keys, leave his lawyers, and prepare his corporation to pay every single dime of stolen rent back into the public trust he had spent a decade trying to crush. She picked up his gold fountain pen, handed it back to him, and told him to get out of her shop. The winter gave way to a crisp golden spring, and with the changing season, the block began to transform. The legal battle never reached the chaotic spectacle of a public trial. The developer's lawyers had recognized the ironclad weight of the historical deeds and settled within weeks. Under the supervision of the federal court, a massive restructuring took place. The revenue from the twin skyscrapers was legally redirected into the revived public trust, and the immense fortune from the century-old municipal gold bonds was finally liquidated. But she did not move into a penthouse, nor did she leave the narrow alleyway that had become her anchor. Instead, she used the wealth to rebuild. The scaffolding came down from the old red brick facade, revealing the beautiful hand-laid masonry that had been choked by soot for 50 years. The jagged windows were replaced with reinforced insulated glass that kept out the chill but let in the sunlight. Inside, the crumbling walls were reinforced, the rotting floorboards replaced with polished oak, and the back of the building was expanded into a state-of-the-art residential sanctuary. It featured warm, dignified rooms, a commercial kitchen serving hot meals, and legal assistance desks for anyone seeking a way off the streets. She called it the Sentinel Trust, a permanent haven for the forgotten souls she had lived alongside for a decade. The front showroom remained exactly as her father had left it, though the dust and cobwebs were gone. The hundreds of antique timepieces had been meticulously cleaned and restored by the city's finest horologists, their brass gears gleaming under soft, warm lighting. Yet, they all remained silent, waiting for the heart of the shop to beat first. On the official opening night of the sanctuary, after the last of the residents had eaten a warm meal and settled into their beds, the shop grew quiet. She walked through the showroom alone, her posture straight and her mind at peace. She wore a simple, elegant woolen dress, her hands no longer trembling from the cold. She walked past the rows of restored maritime chronometers and cuckoo clocks, stepping behind the velvet curtain into the deep rear recess of the workshop. She stood before the 9-foot walnut grandfather clock. The silver celestial face shone brilliantly in the soft light, the brass filigree polished to a mirror finish. The steel wedge that her father had driven into the gears had been carefully extracted, and the internal locks on the primary mainspring barrel were disengaged. The machine was ready. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the heavy, intricately carved iron key. She opened the long glass door of the casing, the wood releasing a faint, familiar scent of old walnut oil. She guided the key into the winding arbor of the great driving weights. Bracing her feet, she turned the key. The mechanism groaned, a deep, resonant sound of sleeping iron waking up. She wound it steadily, feeling the immense, gravitational power of the heavy brass weights rising inside the throat of the clock. She wound it until the cables were taut, storing decades of deferred justice within the steel springs. She stepped back and reached her fingers into the casing, gently touching the massive brass pendulum bob. With a smooth, deliberate motion, she pushed it to the left and let go. The pendulum swung through the darkness, its heavy brass disc cutting a perfect arc. Tick. The sound was deep, thunderous, and metallic, vibrating through the solid oak floorboards and echoing off the brick walls. Tock. A second later, the counterweight dropped, releasing a pocket of air that smelled of fresh oil and old paper. The rhythm took hold. It wasn't just the sound of a machine. It felt like a living pulse, a steady, unyielding heartbeat that filled the entire three-story building. As if answering a call, a series of softer clicks and whirs rippled across the front showroom. One by one, the hundreds of smaller clocks on the walls began to catch the vibration. Pendulums started to sway, escape wheels began to spin, and the entire shop erupted into a beautiful, chaotic symphony of ticking time. The stasis was broken. The legacy was no longer forgotten. She leaned her head against the warm wood of the grandfather clock, listening to the heartbeat of her father's triumph, knowing that time was finally moving forward for everyone.